they're also working hard to diversify away from the United States because we are now viewed as an unreliable partner. And we're seeing a lot of movement between third countries to conclude deals among themselves without the United States. One country I'm watching closely, India.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Wendy, for making time for us. We're so lucky. Wendy has been one of my heroes for decades now. Because of her immense contributions to the free trade agenda. She served for 30 years at USTR and had many accomplishments there, including the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the work on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S.-China negotiations, WTO financial negotiations, very complicated, difficult issues. She's now the Senior Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute, which is a source of immense knowledge and support. Just go to their website and you can pull down amazing essays from all sorts of very interesting people. I think Kevin Rudd is now back.
Next week.
Yeah, as the head there. We're so happy to have Wendy here to tell us about what's going on currently in the trade area. And I thought we would just get started with so the impact of this Middle East war on trade negotiations. Will they just be dead in the water for a while? Are things going on behind the scenes? So what is the impact of this Mideast war on the trade agenda globally?
Well, first, let me just say I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for joining us. I always forget how beautiful the I House is, so I'm glad you have a great view. I wish we could turn around, but whatever. So, yes, the Mideast. So, everyone was so focused on trade and tariffs, and that was really defining our relationship with a lot of our partners for the past year. And with the Mideast developments, I would say that the trade agenda, I wouldn't call it sidelined, but it's not front and center. And I was struck the other day reading that President Trump had a phone call with Prime Minister Modi. And if that call had happened 4 months ago, it would have been all about trade. And the way the call was reported out, it was all about the Mideast. And, we haven't even finalized our trade deal with India yet. And so I think that is indicative that right now there are other burning issues on the agenda. And for many of our trading partners, particularly from this region, they're facing a lot of economic fallout of the Mideast, of the Mideast war. And as a result, they don't have the bandwidth to place the same priority on not only finalizing the negotiations, but getting the deals that they negotiated approved and implementing the deals. And I would just one comment here, and I think it's a good way to sum up. I heard from a good friend of mine who's a trade minister in one of the Asian countries, and he basically said the Mideast situation is taking all of the oxygen out of the air for the trade agenda. And maybe that's an overstatement, but again, I think it's it's reality.
Okay, okay, very good. Thanks so much. I wanted to get that issue off the plate first, because there are a lot of other issues we should not ignore. But it's easy to ignore them when something this wild and crazy is going on. So let's move on actually to the next point, which is the U.S. Supreme Court has now basically said that Trump's first set of tariffs is unconstitutional. You can't do that. Give the money back. We'll see if that happens. But there are other paths that he can use to try to accomplish the same goals. So could you describe some of that, and what is the timeline for taking those other measures?
Sure. So this gets a little technical, like a little bit of alphabet number soup. But I think the one key point I would make is the president took a risk using the statute he did a year ago to impose the tariffs. And this was IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And this is the one where the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional for the president to impose tariffs. There's other tariff authority that Congress has delegated to the president through the years. And now the administration is turning to what it calls a Plan B, And that means relying on these other more traditional statutes. And so for the time being, the administration has put into place a 10% tariff against all of our trading partners under what's called Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act. This statute only allows the tariff to be in place for 150 days. So that means around July 24th, he will no longer be able to use that authority unless Congress, votes for him to continue that tariff. So in the meantime, the president then is relying on another statute, Section 301, which it's a statute we used for many years during the U.S.-Japan trade wars.
Yes.
But that statute now is being used, and the administration has launched 2 new investigations under Section 301, one on forced labor and one on industrial overcapacity. Under forced labor, 60 countries, including Japan, have been targeted. And under the industrial capacity investigation, 16 countries, including Japan, have been targeted. These investigations are happening at a very quick pace. The statute requires, a number of process steps be taken, including holding a public hearing, where the administration will be holding a public hearing in early May. And then the thought process is by July, coincidentally, when the Section 122 tariffs expire, the president will be ready to impose tariffs under Section 301. Why? And so where this gets interesting, though, is that under Section 301, objective investigations are to be conducted. But at the same time, the administration is quietly telling our trading partners, don't worry, you won't be treated any worse than the trade agreement tariffs we have in place. But by saying that, and if in fact they conveniently come out and announce all the same tariff rates under Section 301, I think I'm pretty confident a number of people will run to the courts and try and sue the administration over, not conducting objective investigations according to the statute.
In that case, how long, first of all, do the tariffs remain in force while those suits are under
Yes.
in the court? Okay, if that is the case, then how long do the court cases take to go through?
I mean, it depends, and it depends, when something goes to the Supreme Court, we've seen it could take up to 1 year. So even the Section 122 tariffs that are in place now, they are being adjudicated in the Court of International Trade. And I think 20 governors have joined a suit against the use of Section 122. But people say, even if the courts, if they come out in 5 months from now and say that these tariffs are illegal, they've already done their damage. Although rebates now are being will be required, and those rebate process of the IEEPA tariffs is now under. The CBP is now implementing that directive.
How long will it take for people to get their money back?
Yeah, not quick enough. Everyone wants their money back. It seems that, from what I understand, come April 20th, around then, the CBP, Customs and Border Protection Agency, responsible for giving the rebates, is going to put a new system in place. And once that system is up and running, it will allow companies or the importer on record to then apply for the rebates, which could come to them within a matter of months. But the interesting thing is these rebates are not going to the consumer that has really, borne a lot of the cost. They go to the importer of record, and then it will be up to the company, the Walmarts, the FedExes, whatever. Do they want to give some of that money back to the consumers? And I'm not sure how they would do that. But again, I think there are going to be a lot of people calling foul in the United States, like, where's my rebate? Where's my money?
Very good. What you also mentioned strikes me as a much deeper and more fundamental issue, which is over many, 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 many years. Congress delegated authority to the president, basically because the Congress wanted protection not for the country or this, but for themselves. They didn't want their constituents coming to them and complaining about trade. So, let's just let the president do it. Okay. And then we have USTR, which is formed basically to protect Congress by having a real process that is legal and transparent and stuff. This idea of delegating powers to the president doesn't look quite as good today as it did a few years ago. Do you expect Congress to make any changes, take back that power, maybe have a congressional institution that makes these decisions instead of letting the president do everything?
Well, I think what you're saying, Robbie, makes eminent sense. But given Washington politics these days, it's unclear to me whether Congress could really come together to do that. But clearly, our trade laws do need a refresh, not only with respect to the president's, let's just say, enthusiastic use of these
yes, enthusiastic.
Of these authorities, but also, other things have happened too. So some of our, trade laws, for example, make it very difficult to take actions until you can show injury.
Right.
But a lot of times, by the time you show injury, you're out of business. So this trade law hasn't really done you a lot, done you a lot of good. So there are, for years, there have been proposals about updating these trade statutes and maybe getting rid of some. But, I'd like to say that this will happen. But wow, watching our Congress operate these days, I'm not at all confident that that's on the radar screen.
Okay. Which brings us, in a way, into politics. We've got midterm elections coming up. In the last several elections, tariffs were a big deal, trade was a big deal, people were playing victim, et cetera, using trade as a political football back and forth. And now we've got some of the impact of the tariffs sort of on people's pocketbooks. We have other affordability issues. So what do you think the prospects are for a serious debate in the United States about the impact of trade on the country? Will that be part of the election?
Yeah, I think leading up to the midterms, I don't think, I think it's not going to be tariffs per se, as you said. It's going to be more this agenda of affordability. So the combination of high tariffs paying more for food, for consumer goods, for businesses paying more for their inputs, combined with, housing prices that are skyrocketing in the United States. And now when you put on top of it the oil, the gas price increases, this all can come together and I think really bite the Republican Party in the upcoming elections. And you're already seeing some Republicans in particular quietly, not publicly, but quietly talking to the president and the White House, trying to convince them that, they need to kind of back off some of these tariffs, provide more exclusions, not move so quickly to impose new tariffs. And and the Democrats are having a field day, right? Because this is really the crux of many of the campaigns, I think, that will be going forward. You've talked about the impact of the tariffs on the Republican Party. It gives the Democrats a tool to deal with, but the Democrats haven't been exactly pro-free trade either. I think it was in 2016, I knew that the world had changed when Hillary Clinton came out and said she wanted to redo TPP. Because that basically is just surrender, okay? So what is the Democratic Party position on this, and will they be able to sort of improve the economy through their own tariff policies? Yeah, so look. Is there a party? That's another question. Well, you're absolutely right. When it comes to trade, the Democratic Party has been really splintered for many years. So you have kind of the moderate Democrats, the new Democrats, they used to be called the Blue Dogs, who were, very pro-free trade. But then you have, a lot of the progressive wing of the party, which is very anti-trade. And during the Biden administration, what we saw play out was that basically trade was so controversial for the party that basically we didn't have a trade agenda, or it was very minimal. It was all about taking steps to help it was called a worker-centered trade policy, but for the most part, it didn't involve negotiations with our partners overseas. It was very domestically focused. So right now, when you look at the polling, the Democrats look like they're more pro-free trade than the Republicans, which during my career, it was completely opposite.
Right.
Like we would bring home trade agreements to get approved by Congress, and, we start vote counting, right? Because you want to make sure they're going to get through Congress. You need a majority in each house. And you would basically count, maybe we would need 20, 25 Democratic votes because you could count on all these Republican votes. This is completely changed now.
Totally different.
And, with Trump's impact on the Republican Party, a lot of the moderate Democrats who are supportive of business and international trade have either left the Senate or the House, have lost in their elections, or have basically decided to get with the Trump agenda here.
As part of the impact on affordability, I was in the U.S. in October 24, and I saw a sign in somebody's yard. I was just taking a little walk. This is in New Hampshire. I saw a sign in somebody's yard that said, Harris, high prices, Trump, low prices. It's kind of not the way it's worked out, but what are the calculations about the actual impact on, the pocketbook of your average American of these Trump tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of studies that have come out, and everything from I've seen hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars, but it's such a evolving process, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard for any economist to come out because everything's changing.
Yeah.
The tariff rates are changing all the time, and over time also the administration isn't broadcasting it, but they are giving more product exclusions. So, for example, let's just say right now we have a 50% tariff on Brazil, which is probably lower now because of IEPA. But before IEPA was overturned, we had a 50% tariff on Brazil, but 50% of Brazilian exports to the U.S. were excluded. So even though you're hearing about a high tariff, you need to look at the product coverage. And I think there we may see more product exclusions going forward, but I think they will be done quietly and not broadcasted. And there's no process like there has been in previous administrations for securing exclusions. And a lot of that is just really left up to CEOs going down to Mar-a-Lago and making their case.
Right.
And many have been successful. But the traditional ways that companies used to come and they'd, fill out forms, and then an interagency process would look at these and a product specialist would evaluate them. That's kind of all in the past. This is pretty discretionary now.
Yeah, okay. A couple things on that I also want to ask about. One is I've got a lot of sympathy for the customs agents. Because what's the schedule? Are they able to figure out what's going on and apply the tariffs as they're directed to do? That is, what is just the implementation process? So that's one thing. The other thing is, you talked about CEOs going down to Mar-a-Lago to, try to make their case. How do they get there? Is there some quid pro quo? What do they have to do to get an invitation to go make their pitch?
Okay, I'm not exactly sure. They find a way. They find an airplane. They get there. They get themselves invited. Sometimes you'll see coincidentally a company will get some type of exclusion, and all of a sudden they're contributing to the fund to rebuild the White House or to rebuild the Kennedy Center. So they're seeing. Let's just say I think Trump is masterful as a negotiator sometimes. So some of that is going on. But really, some CEOs, they're able just to make their case. Mr. President, if you put this tariff in place, you're going to hurt the U.S. consumer in these states, which are important for re-election, for the midterm election. So again, I don't think it's all quid pro quo. I think some of it is CEOs being able to convince the president that their product exclusion makes sense. With respect to, it's not just the Customs and Border Protection folks, but the whole U.S. government. This is all coming at a time when the U.S. government, under the Trump administration, is being downsized. And so you have fewer people and fewer experts now. A lot of people are retiring, early retirement. A number of people, went through the Doge thing and were, let go. And that has impacted a lot of agencies. But I will say my home agency, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, they, for the most part, they have not been touched by any of this. If anything, they're getting a larger budget. And Ambassador Greer in particular is someone who the career staff really enjoy working with. He treats them well, he values their input, they're leading negotiations. In other agencies, it's very different. At CBP, they have an enormous task ahead of them that they're doing now, and it's very hard for them to keep up with everything because, for each country, the tariffs are changing. You have different authorities, so for different products, there are different tariffs under different statutes. And then things are changing, right? The president is threatening a higher tariff. If he goes ahead with that, they have to impose that. So, look, they're doing the best they can. And, the way this all operates, too, is that there is time for them to work through, even once a good comes in and they assign, let's just say, assign a tariff if there is a mistake or something happens, there is time to kind of work that out, during the coming year as well. Are there, this is a little bit tangential, but are there initiatives to use AI or technology to make that process smoother and more efficient? Absolutely. And I think the one thing, when I mentioned on the rebate system, they are coming up with a new electronic system to make it easier. So it's done, done much more efficiently than it used to be. That's great. That's very, very good news. Let me switch gears now a little bit, if I may, to talk about bilateral relations. Perhaps the biggest one on the agenda right now is the Trump-Xi summit coming up. Lots of things going on in Ukraine and the Middle East. China's definitely involved since they get so much oil from Iran, et cetera. So how do you see the trade issues evolving in this upcoming Trump-Xi summit? Yeah, so Presidents Trump and Xi are scheduled to meet in Beijing now in mid-May. This visit was postponed from last month due to the Mideast conflict. I think expectations are very modest for this meeting in terms of what we call deliverables in Washington or concrete outcomes, the announcements they'll make. Compared to previous summit meetings between the president of China and the president of the United States, there's been very modest engagement between the teams. I mean, in my days, when the two were meeting, you would have nonstop negotiations leading up to that meeting, not only at my level, but at the vice minister's level and then at the minister's level. This time around, you're not seeing a lot of engagement. Now, some of it is private, some of it is virtual. But, the face-to-face meeting that was held between Bessent and Greer and their counterpart, the vice premier, was in Paris a few weeks ago. And, I think they're talking about another virtual discussion, but that's it. And again, if you have those kind of meetings, particularly with the Chinese, the prospects for anything big being announced is pretty marginal. Pretty marginal, yeah. So then what am I expecting? I think, there are a number of things that could be announced. And before I go into them, I would just also preview that this year, this will not be the only time that Trump and Xi will meet. There's a possibility of 4 meetings this year. Oh, my. My view is I have a hard time seeing that there'll be more than 3. But again, the president will go to Beijing in mid-May. There is talk about Xi Jinping coming to a reciprocal visit this summer, and I just question that visit. But putting that aside, China is hosting APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, in November, and Trump is planning to travel to Beijing for that, or not Beijing, Shenzhen for that. And then the U.S. is hosting the G20 in December, and Xi Jinping is scheduled to attend that meeting. So up to 4 meetings. And in some ways, that does take the pressure off having to make all the announcements at the first meeting. But I think, again, what could be announced at this meeting? Well, number one, as we all know, the president loves big numbers, big transactional transactional announcements. And so I am expecting that China will announce major new purchases of U.S. agriculture, U.S. energy, U.S. airplanes, and things like that. And I think that is something they have been working through. Second, keep in mind that when the two presidents met last October in Korea, they agreed to what's called a trade truce, that they both agreed to stabilization, de-escalation, and basically, neither side taking other measures that would upset this truce. And it's supposed to last for 1 year. And I think there will be an effort to roll that truce over for at least another year, if not through the whole tenure of President Trump's second term. Third, there is talk on the trade side of establishing what's called a board of trade, which is a mechanism. It's basically a mechanism for U.S. and Chinese officials to meet. But here, what I'm really watching for, even though I think both sides just, would agree to set up some committee, the mandate is going to be very important. From the U.S. perspective, they're looking at this Board of Trade as a forum that would only deal with non-strategic goods. So it wouldn't deal with semiconductors, not with critical minerals, probably not with cars. I mean, there's going to be a debate on what's a strategic good or not a non-strategic good. But USTR is also talking about this would be a forum to manage trade in non-sensitive sectors. And, a lot of, my career dealing with Japan 20 years ago, we talked a lot about managed trade, and we tried to do that. And that's really hard to do.
It's hard to do.
And the notion, in my view, that China is going to agree to the word managed in any, mandate for this group, we'll need to see. We'll need to see. So I'm going to watch very closely if this board is announced, what are its responsibilities, what are its functions, what are its outcomes going to be? Because if there isn't agreement going into this, you could see this becoming a talk shop perhaps, and something that could even lead to more friction between the U.S. and China.
It seems to me from what you're saying that in a way there's a violation of the fundamental rule of meetings, which is never have a meeting unless you already know the outcome before it starts.
Which is not Donald Trump's style.
It's not his style, yeah. So it makes me a little worried when I see the two top guys getting together and deciding things because they typically don't have enough information. But whatever, so that's just the world we live in right now.
And I will say, having worked with the Chinese through the years, they really, for them, a scripted meeting is like the most important thing. If they're going to put their leader in any meeting, they want to make sure there are no surprises.
Yeah. And they do their homework.
Exactly. And again, the way this administration operates is even the ministers, our cabinet officials, they don't have final say, right? And I'll hear from, some foreign countries, they've never seen anything like this, that you're meeting with the USTR or the Secretary of Treasury, and they'll say, well, we think we can do this, but we're going to need to check and get the president's blessing. Now, it's not like the former presidents didn't have input and decide, but that process would happen simultaneously, right? So you would get the mandate to negotiate, and you felt very comfortable that this was clearly within your, within your responsibility and your mandate.
Yeah. Okay. Now that's dealing with the U.S.-China relationship itself, but there are other partners in the regions. And I'm wondering how the Asian countries view this U.S.-China truce, or how they will view the outcome of this Trump-Xi meeting, in terms particularly of, which sort of trade agreement countries do you want to join in with? Is the outcome of the Trump-Xi meetings going to impact the way CPTPP works? Will that lose some momentum and then RCEP get more momentum? What's the sort of Asian reaction to all this?
Right. So, look, I think, the whole world is going to be watching this summit very closely and to see if stabilized relations can continue between the United States and China. And I think for the most part, most countries would welcome the continuation of stabilization and non-escalation of tensions between the U.S. and China. That said, there are also some concerns. One concern is that if there's a concern that Trump may treat China better than them.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you're Vietnam and right now you're facing a 20% tariff, if the president, in meeting with Xi Jinping, decides to lower the tariffs for China, you could end up in a situation where the tariffs between China and other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, are equivalent, or don't give the other countries the advantage they've had so far to attract a lot of foreign direct investment as companies decide to move out of China. So, they're looking at that. They want stabilization, but they also don't want to lose their edge vis-a-vis China and tariffs. But let's just be honest, even though they're negotiating with the United States, as you mentioned, Robbie, they're also working hard to diversify away from the United States and to reduce their dependence on the United States because we are now viewed as an unreliable partner. And so, they're looking at their supply chains, they're looking at their choke points, they're looking at their dependencies, and there are a lot of efforts, and we're seeing a lot of movement between third countries to conclude deals among themselves without the United States being part of these agreements. And I'll tell you one country I'm watching closely, India. India is moving full steam ahead, concluding trading deals recently with the EU, with Australia, and with other countries, New Zealand and other countries as well. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And the CPTPP that you mentioned now has a number of countries now expressing interest to join the CPTPP.
Yeah.
And frankly, I think it's a little overwhelming for those current partners, and they're discussing which accession applications to accept.
That's very interesting because, yes, the U.S. is a less reliable trade partner. Is China suffering the same way? That is from the other countries, the non-U.S., non-China countries. Are they also viewing China as an unreliable trade partner?
I think it's all relative now.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a poll out by the Southeast Asian think tank that does this every year. And this year, and I forget the exact question, but the guts of it was 52% of the respondents found China to be a more reliable trading partner than the United States, was at 48%. And a year earlier, those numbers were completely reversed.
Right.
And earlier, the U.S. was much higher than China. I think many countries, they've dealt with China. They know what they're facing. And a number of them have faced, economic coercion. A number of them feel that, they don't have a lot of leeway when it comes to things China complains about. So they're viewing, their eyes are open.
Yeah.
But that said, they're also looking at China as, an innovation hub, a manufacturing hub, and
renewable energy hub.
And let's be honest, China is playing this card. But there are a lot of words. China talks a lot about this, right? They want to view themselves as the guardian of the international trading system. And I think countries, they kind of like a number of you in the audience, they're kind of rolling their eyes when they see that. But China continues to try and capitalize on this at a time when the U.S. again, we're being, there's just a lack of trust with the United States right now.
Okay, let's move on to Japan. What do you think the next steps in U.S.-Japan trade are? And is Japan going to be off the hook of U.S.-Japan trade negotiations as long as the investments keep flowing?
Yeah. So you're right. So the U.S. and Japan reached a trade and investment deal. And it's the investment part of this agreement, the $550 billion investment fund, that is really the heart of that agreement, although there was also agreement on a 15% tariff and some other dealing with certain non-tariff measures and other things. Look, compared to other allies, I think Japan is probably doing the best, okay? We have a lot of problems with Europe, if you haven't noticed.
Yes, we've noticed.
Trump is not happy with Korea's implementation of the deal that was reached between the U.S. and Seoul in October. and a number of our other allies. Let's just say Canada's not in a good spot. And so in a lot of ways, Japan seems to be doing all the right things. And for the most part, let's be honest, I think it's a very different Japan than the Japan I negotiated with through the years, right? But there still are regulatory obstacles, and there still are some non-tariff measures, particularly in the agriculture sector, that are being worked on. But my view is, for now, as long as Japan keeps kind of rolling out announcements of new investment projects, and I'll say here, even though some of them are kind of half-baked and they're not finalized, the president likes that. Big numbers, big investments, he can point to those. I think as long as those investment announcements keep coming, and they're moving towards, an upward trajectory in terms of billions of dollars, I think Japan is in a much better spot than a number of our trading partners. But I hear from all our partners, they're all kind of on edge. Because you could be in Donald Trump's good graces one day, only to find yourself a week later on his, and I won't use the first word, but on that bad list.
Yes, the bad list, yes.
And just this week, we saw his girlfriend from Italy, Meloni. All of a sudden there's friction there because she's not very supportive of the U.S. position in Iran.
Right, yeah.
So again, fair weather friends, maybe.
Fair weather friends, yeah. You also noted one thing, if I may go into this, on the agricultural restrictions, et cetera. One of the things that the Middle East developments has suggested is a very sharp negative impact on fertilizer supply. Some countries are now talking about export restrictions on food. That scares Japan a lot. Okay. We also have farm population in Japan, very old. The U.S. average age of farmers is 61. In Japan, it's like 69. There are some areas where, obviously, it's much over that. Do you see an opportunity in what's going on now, finally, for some change in the Japanese agricultural sector that would benefit, investors who want to put some money into what should be a very profitable opportunity?
Again, Robbie, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but a lot of this is just bogged down in politics.
Yeah.
And I always remember, and I think this is now 25 years ago, working for Bob Zoellick at USTR, and he was convinced at that time that the average age of the Japanese farmer was way too old, and so therefore Japan would open its agriculture market, and he was, really pushed Japan, and Japan kind of, I always remember this, his meetings with the Japanese, Minister of Agriculture, and he had this detailed presentation about why it's in Japan's interest to open up its agriculture market. And I'll always remember his frustration because the Japanese ag minister wasn't really listening. He had a presentation that he wanted to go through, and that included whatever, like 50% self-sufficiency. So there was no discussion, and he was so frustrated. And after that meeting, I remember meeting with my Japanese counterpart, and we both just knew the next 3 years of trade talks were going to be really, really difficult.
Tough.
Really tough.
I have a little model that I use to deal with this called the CRIC cycle: crisis, response, improvement, and complacency.
Okay.
Rice prices going from 2,000 yen at the end of 23 to 4,000 yen today has not triggered agricultural reform.
Right.
Do they have to go to 8,000, 10,000? That's the situation we're in, but it's not impossible. Japan has enough fertilizer at the moment, so the ag guys tell me. But when that runs out, what do we do? I heard last night that the plantings in Australia are down like 50%. Oh my. And they are a big supplier to the whole world. So there's something going on in food that could be very
and U.S. farmers, remember, we're not hit like other countries.
That's right.
They were hurting even before all of this, and now they're getting some subsidies, and they're pushing the administration to open markets to get tariffs down. And again, this is going to be a sideshow for these countries. They're not thinking about how they're going to welcome more U.S. imports.
Right.
It's more about just trying to get through week by week and doing what they need to do to make sure their agriculture sector remains in place and vibrant.
Yeah. My colleagues tell me that the U.S. fertilizer stocks are pretty good, that the farmers have bought 3/4 of what they need for this year. So if anything hits with fertilizer, it'll be next year in the U.S., but not in other countries.
Okay.
So that's another thing we have to worry about is when things, gum up, then what happens to the system as a whole. Speaking of which, I understand from you that USTR Greer has said that the WTO is dysfunctional, irrelevant. Where do you think the WTO goes in the future? Talking about the global system.
Yeah, good question. So there was a meeting of the WTO ministers, which happens every 2 years, a few weeks ago in Cameroon. And let's just say the expectations were modest for deliverables, and the WTO members were somehow couldn't even reach the expectations that were set. So the few type of deliverables that were supposed to be announced, including the continuing this moratorium on duties for digital transmissions, could not be agreed upon.
Really?
And so it's a real setback for the WTO. My view, and this is expressed it just happens today in the Straits Times. I just had an op-ed on the WTO. My view is that the days of the WTO kind of leading trade and being on the forefront of negotiations, those days are over. They made sense, and the WTO worked as long as there were fewer members and that all members kind of had that same objective of trade liberalization. Today, the WTO is 166 members, many with different priorities, competing interests, and geopolitical divides. And so the notion that they're all going to come together and agree on all this stuff, I think those days are over. So what I'm advocating is not that we leave the WTO or we abolish the organization. I think we should just be realistic, and that the WTO should be viewed as more of a supporting actor versus the leading actor. And it does a lot of this day-to-day work in Geneva that is important. It's technical. They've been able to head off some disputes. They are a venue where notifications are made of new trade measures. They have committees that meet and talk about this stuff. So all of those functions are important. They're not sexy, but I don't think we're going back to the world where the WTO is everything. Like when I first joined USTR, my first job was in the WTO office. And if you wanted a career in trade, you had to work in that office, and everyone wanted to go to Geneva.
Yeah.
And, it's completely different now. Like Geneva's almost viewed as an assignment where you're going to be like lost and forgotten versus like in the forefront of everything. And, I think it's indicative of kind of where the global trading system is. And that is, it worked well for a long time, but now we're in a different era. The current system is over, but no one knows yet what the new system is going to look like. And that's what we're seeing now. Different countries are coming up with proposals, including the U.S., of the type of system that they want, that they see, or that they favor. But there's no consensus on that. I think over time, we may see some coalescing over certain principles or certain mechanisms, but we're not going back to having an international multilateral trade negotiating body, in my view.
Yeah. What you were saying earlier about the Trump-Xi results and how Vietnam might object to it, this and that, I think has a relationship to what we're talking about now. Because if I remember the history of this correctly, the U.S. put the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in, disaster. 1934 rolls around and they say, okay, we'll leave the law, but we're going to have a new concept called most favored nation. And what you're telling me now is that MFN notion is dead, but we don't know what the successor will be. Any ideas what it should be?
So in the U.S. view, this most favored nation principle has outlived its usefulness. And that basically says that if you lower your tariff in negotiations with Japan, for example, then you have to give that same low tariff to all other WTO members, okay, regardless of what they're giving you. And that's kind of a crazy concept. If you're a negotiator, if you're in India, you're watching what everything else is going on, and then you're out there going, okay, me too, me too. And I think what the United States and certain other countries are beginning to express is that concept no longer works in today's world. And so what they're looking at is ways to either get rid of MFN or somehow to adjust it. And one way to adjust it would be, and this is where I think the trading system is going to, that you have more and more of what are called plurilateral arrangements, subsets of countries negotiating on certain topics, like whether it be critical minerals or pharmaceuticals or supply chains, and that they could give each other tariff relief, but then, they would not be required to extend those benefits to others.
Outside that group,
exactly.
Yeah. So coalition of the willing.
Exactly, a coalition of the willing approach. And I think that's the most realistic. But it's not as efficient as the WTO.
Yeah.
And, we're just watching now, it's interesting because Trump has really underscored that for him, the bilateral venue for negotiations is his favorite mechanism. Because in his view, one-to-one, the United States has all the power, and we can, tell other countries what to do. If they're a group of countries, he's thinking they can gang up on us, right? And, then they have more power as a collective unit. So why would I want to negotiate like that? But over time, particularly with this critical minerals work where the U.S. is leading different groupings of countries, including Japan, to reach an agreement, to come up with other sources of critical minerals to allow everyone to reduce their dependence on China, the U.S. is participating in that. And USTR Greer has said that, that could be a model for other sectors, and I think he named pharmaceuticals. So we may see over the next 3 years, a movement and a recognition that this bilateral mechanism not only is not efficient, but also you're much more powerful when you work with countries, like-minded countries that share your objectives and your interests.
Well, in a different area, it may be that he's trying out this bilateral approach now with Iran, and it's not working.
Right.
So you need allies. It's a good lesson. Let's see.
But he's kind of lacking a coalition of the willing.
That's right. Yes, one other willing country. Okay. You mentioned before that some countries are reducing their dependence on the U.S. What are the alternatives? The U.S. market is pretty big. The American consumer loves to buy things, but if they don't want the American consumer to buy things anymore because they're not a reliable trading partner, who do they sell to?
Look, and that's a great point because no matter, in my view, regardless of all these diversification efforts that countries are embarking on, and I would do the same thing if I were in their shoes, the U.S. is still the largest market. We consume a lot of stuff. And countries and companies want to send their stuff to the United States. So we still have a lot of market power. And, we're an innovation hub. We're still growing and all of that. There are so many positives about the United States. So this notion that, we're going to be frozen out, I don't think that's viable. But I do think that over time, we're going to see countries reducing dependence on the U.S. And frankly, the U.S., particularly in strategic sectors, we're trying to reduce our reliance on China.
Yes.
And China is actively looking to reduce its reliance on everyone. So we're not alone here.
Okay, very good. We're coming up toward the end, but just before we start Q&A, I have one question that I often ask is, on these issues, what should we read? What authors should we read? What articles should we read? What books should we read? Any
tweets?
Tweets, yes.
It's a great question. There's some great historians on international trade, and one of the best books I think is this book by Doug Irwin from Dartmouth, and now I'm forgetting the name. I think it's Charting the Course on International Trade, but he gives a great historical perspective on trade. Paul Bluestein, who's got strong ties to Japan, I think he lives here now. Yeah. He has a new book on the dollar, but he wrote a great book about the WTO. John Jackson is someone else who's written a lot. But I would say these are all historical. And what we're going through now is completely different. And so while it's interesting to read these books, it's more for historical purposes to understand maybe why the system as created made sense, for many, many years. But there are certain people now who, through their op-eds and through different social media postings that I pay a lot of attention to, including Peter Harrell, who served in the Biden administration, who writes about economic security issues, critical minerals, but also on trade, and he's a lawyer by training. He's very good. Chris Padilla, who's a former colleague of mine, a close advisor for many years to Bob Zellick, who was an IBM executive. He's a lot of thoughtful pieces coming out from him. And I'd like to think, can I promote myself?
Of course. Do you have a book coming out?
If you have time. No, I don't have a book coming out.
Okay, good.
Because by the time you write a book in this area,
it's old. Yeah.
Things are evolving day to day. We always laugh in the trade world now. If you give a speech, for an hour you haven't, you're not checking your phone. That you've said all these things, and then you go check your phone, and what you just said is completely discredited by the president.
Yes.
But you said he'll never go ahead with that tariff, and only to find out an hour later, guess what? He just went ahead and did that. Yeah. So talk at your own peril.
If I could add one other, it would be Albert Hirschman. Long dead economist, but he wrote a wonderful piece about international trade and global power.
Okay.
And he's worth reading. Okay. Whatever he writes is worth reading. So, okay, very good. Let me open things up for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Wendy. A real sort of tour de force. Quick couple of questions. You mentioned a few of the sort of alphabet soup. 301, 122. You didn't mention 232. I know there's some outstanding investigations on machine tools and robotics, for example. So I was wondering where sort of 232 fits in this sort of pantheon of investigations that are ongoing. And then one other item that sort of you mentioned obliquely, but the term global imbalances sort of used to be a big part of the G7 agenda, certainly with China having had a $1.2 trillion surplus last year. I think it's up 22% year on year as far as sort of through February. Wondering your sort of comments on that agenda and what we might be able to do to manage that, because clearly that's causing a lot of tensions and displacement in a lot of parts of the world.
Yeah. So yes, first with the 232s, I should have mentioned that. The 232s, that's a provision of the 1962 Trade Act, and that allows the president to restrict imports due to national security threats. And this is a statute that has been used to impose tariffs on automotive products, on steel and aluminum, copper, and this administration has initiated a lot of other Section 232 investigations. Some have resulted in additional tariffs. Some have pointed and instructed, like critical minerals, to go ahead and negotiate, and some are ongoing investigations, like the robotics one you mentioned. I'm hearing that we may see some additional 232 tariffs, but that there is concern that some of these investigations aren't as thorough as they should be, and that maybe there's a feeling that maybe they've gone too far with some of these. Because some of the findings that are announced now, they're not announcing tariffs, they're announcing negotiations or other things. But I think we all need to be vigilant on that front, because there are a number of ongoing investigations where conclusions will need to be announced. With respect to global imbalances, and this really has to do with the issue of excess capacity in China, you're totally right. Last year, China's global trade surplus with the world was $1.2 trillion. For January, February, that trend suggests that the number will go up. China just yesterday came out with its March statistics. That number's come down a little, but it's too early. It's a 1 month, and the reasons why it came down, including due to the Lunar New Year, factors. But I think this is an extremely, extremely serious problem and strain on the global trading system. And, there are discussions where countries are telling China that you really need to promote your domestic consumer demand, that if there was more demand domestically, then China would have less to export. I personally, I'm very cynical about that. I think there will be efforts in China, but they'll never be.
They'll never get there.
Sufficient. And why is that? Because I think in the China of today, they're more comfortable helping producers than
Yes.
consumers, and that they worry that their political agenda could be endangered or threatened or impacted if indeed consumers are given more and more power. But I do think that this is a ripe issue for the United States and other trading partners who are also really impacted by, excuse me, by exploding Chinese imports, to rally together to pressure China to turn this off, or to collectively come up with tariff walls that would leave China no choice but to reduce its domestic production. Whether that will happen or not remains to be seen, but I would like to see the United States leading the charge here.
It's interesting because my old boss, Steve Roach, wrote a book years ago about codependence between China and the United States. So they can do the stuff that's dumb that they want to do if you let us do the stuff that's dumb that we want to do. And in order to get China to do the things that Wendy was just talking about, the U.S. or other trading partners would have to stop doing the dumb things that they're doing. I wrote a piece a few years ago called Make America Save Again. It's not happening. So you'd somehow have to get the U.S. consumer to start saving, but that's really difficult when income distribution is so bad. So these are, I think, internal structural problems in the economy, but also problems in the political economy of both countries, and that's kind of a hard thing. That's why I have the crick cycle.
Thank you. I really enjoy listening to your talk. My question is about relating to a coalition of willingness. So we know that each country is making decisions based on their national security, economic security, or critical resources, minerals concerns. What is the role of WTO or international community? Because as you mentioned, we are moving from multilateral to bilateral or more central focus on national interest. What is the role of international organization, and what could Japan contribute to maintain the economic stability in the global economic security through international organization? Thank you.
Yeah, so economic security is becoming more and more important, and in many ways overshadowing the old concept of trade liberalization. So if you look at the trade agreements that the U.S. is concluding now with partners, there are provisions on economic security. But this issue is basically absent from the WTO, and USTR Greer has said that the WTO is incapable of dealing with these issues. And that makes a lot of sense, because let's be honest, a lot of these economic security issues, whether you're dealing with investment restrictions or export controls on high technology products, or dealing with non-market economies, are all issues that involve China. So China and a number of other countries are never going to let the WTO go ahead and address these issues. So they are being dealt with either bilaterally or within groups of countries. And frankly, Japan has been on the forefront of this agenda, coming up with its own economic security minister a number of years ago, coming out with, law after law, regulation after regulation, defining these areas. And I think this is a real opportunity for Japan to, work with other countries and to really lead an agenda. And again, I think this is an area where the U.S. is much more open to working with trading partners than on traditional trade issues.
Thank you very much. My question is just about the U.S.-China trade deal this year, next month or in this year. So you already covered a lot of things already, but I just want to know what is the top priority for the U.S. negotiator in the negotiation with China. You mentioned about big number issue, like agriculture, Boeing issue, and also you mentioned about energy. But I think previously, many people in Washington talk about United States may want to see big investment from China to U.S. market. So is it still the top priority, or in the past also some U.S. negotiator implied they really opened up market in China? So which way has a more priority for the U.S. negotiator, and also the inbound investment plan to United States is still realistic? So this is my question.
Yeah. So look, I'm really skeptical about big announcements inviting a lot more Chinese investment into the United States. The president, however, he has kind of teased this out in recent months, saying that he would welcome investment. I personally think that's to the dismay of his advisors, but putting that aside. Interesting there, when people talk about this announcing a board of trade, there was also talk maybe a board of investment would also be established to see if there were mechanisms to allow Chinese investment into the United States. If not greenfield investment, maybe licensing arrangements or joint ventures or things like that. And I think this topic has been under serious interagency review in the United States. And I thought it was very interesting. Just about 2 weeks ago, Ambassador Greer came out and basically threw cold water on the investment objectives. And he's pretty cautious. So for him to do that suggests to me that those who are skeptical of inviting more Chinese investment into the U.S. have kind of convinced the others that this is not the way to go. There has been mention that maybe there would be like some discrete investment projects could be announced, but the notion of having like a board of investment looking at all types of deals and welcoming investment, I just don't see that happening. And remember, there's so many restrictions in the United States on investment, including CFIUS, which looks at the national security implications of investments, but also there are a lot of state regulations. There are regulations on, on where, how close to a military base or whether you can invest in agriculture land. So there's a lot of restrictions. So I'm not expecting like a flood of Chinese investment in the U.S. anytime soon.
One from Glenn Fukushima from San Francisco.
Oh, hi, Glenn.
Assuming there is a U.S. administration in January 2029 that recognizes the importance of trade and the need for the U.S. to play a leading role in, what is the agenda or priorities that the U.S. should pursue, including WTO, CPTPP, TTIP, bilaterals, etc., or something completely new? And what would be the domestic policies to regain support for trade?
In 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes.
A lot of questions.
Look, I think the point I want to leave everyone with, and maybe conclude on this note, and that is we're in the area of the unknown right now in international trade. I think there is agreement that the existing system that served us well it doesn't work anymore. But no one's been able to collectively come up with that new system. A new administration will come in and will have, a lot of decisions to make. But I think if folks are expecting that a new president, Republican or Democrat, would come in and lift all these tariffs unilaterally, that is not going to happen in my view. I think they'll be under enormous pressure to show what they got in return for lifting the tariffs. And so you may see many more negotiations, which will provide the venue to lift some of the tariffs. But I think, this is, I'm not even sure in the next administration that there'll be the kind of clarity that businesses would like about what the international trading system should look like. I think we're coming into a period where there's going to be continued uncertainty, even if there's a president who's more predictable.
That's sort of a Gorbachev problem. He wanted glasnost and perestroika, but he didn't know what he would do with it.
Right.
Okay, very good. Unfortunately, I think we have to end here, so please join me in thanking Wendy. Now you know why she's my hero, because she's so logical, so well-informed, and so easy to understand when she explains things. She doesn't have a cape, but she's a hero. So thank you very much.